Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Octant community meeting. Today, we got a bunch of stuff that we want to cover. Of course, we're going to talk about the 0.11 release, our upcoming focus, and we have a demo as well from Milan at the end of this. And if you have anything that you want to add to the agenda, please look at the agenda that I shared in the chat there, and I'll share my screen as well so you all can view the agenda as we go through it. All right, and with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Wayne.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, so we released 0.11. That came out on when did we do? It was last
Friday.
Week. Friday. 5 days ago. So there is a lot of good changes in there, a lot of speed improvements, some reworking of how terminals were working. We also replaced the existing YAML viewer with a read-only version of Monaco. A lot of these things we've been talking about on the meetup meetings here, but just for those who aren't familiar or just joining for the first time or watching this for the first time, this last release was focused on making a lot of speed improvements and just kind of usability improvements around the YAML viewer, terminal, upgrading to Clarity 9, and creating the Electron Application stub, which was all part of upgrading Clarity and Angular 9 and Clarity 3. So all of that has been released in 0.11. There was a couple, I think some issues came in right after this release that have been since fixed, minor bugs and documentation things that have been merged in. But so far, this release has been doing well for us. There was, I want to highlight and call out that there was some breaking API changes around the plugins, specifically the call to get store and how the path is accessed when you are looking at requests. It was changed from a property into a method. This was done to allow for proper mocking unit testing of plugins. Another thing that was added to help with that was we changed how the logging interface was, where it was located essentially, and we moved it from the internal logging package out to package.log. So thank you to Jordan who worked on that. That was he's on here now, and so I really appreciate that work. I think Jordan also did the there was another thing. Oh, thank you. Yeah, the persistent volume printer. So that was all really useful. Yeah. So this. Oh, and I do want to call out the work that Milan did on the logging interface. To me, in my head, the logging stuff has been in there, but this was part of 0.11. You can now do searching and filtering and grepping through logs in the log viewer. So the huge improvement over what we had before. What we had before was kind of this plain, not really usable log viewer. It's just like, here's a bunch of text, go do it yourself. And now it's you can step through and hide and filter matches and use regular expressions to go through things. So we're following that up in the work that I'm doing right now, which is to make the logger a combined viewer of all of the containers that are running within a pod. So that'll be in part of the next release, but it'll be going into master here very soon. So anyway, feel free to check out all of the changes on the release page. There's lots of fixes. Sam did a bunch of speed improvements and updates around page refreshes and load times and efficiencies, taking advantage of the upgrade we did to Angular 9. So a lot of that work is there, and you'll experience a much more responsive use of Octant as well. So yeah, so that's it for the new release. So any questions or comments on the 0.11 release? Check chat here.
The only question I have is, are all the homebrew and everything, is that updated? Or the
it's in flight. Yeah, I think some of that stuff lags, but I haven't confirmed. Sam might know the answer offhand.
Yeah, so Homebrew is done, Scoop is done, and for Chocolatey, I found out we were actually, I never got notified of this, but we are a trusted maintainer. That means if it passes the auto scan, whatever they do to check for malicious software on their package manager, it just publishes. So I think our lead time is now probably closer to 2 days instead of a week on Windows.
Oh, well, that's great news.
That's awesome.
Yeah, congratulations us. Thank you, Sam. All right, moving on. So I wanted to kind of go over quickly the upcoming focus that we're going to be, this is stuff we're going to be prioritizing in the next set of work that we're going to be doing. We touched on this a little bit in the last meeting, but I just kind of wanted to now go into a little more detail. It's going to be switching over to work on it. So one of the big focuses, which we were intending to get to in 11, but some things caused it to get pushed, was the documentation, specifically around creating clear separation between user content, creator content, so plugin authors, and core content. So like you want to make changes directly to Octant core. Right now, there is not a great distinction between octant.dev, repo that's in the markdown, and the different hacking guides and contributing guides. It's a little muddy and confusing. So we want to create a clear guide for how to get started writing plugins. That'll exist on octant.dev. It will be what people are used to when they go in to start writing new software for a platform. It will be, here's how you copy and paste these things into your environment, clone this repo, which will be our Octant sample plugin repo, and then run these commands, and you will have a working plugin that you can start hacking on. Right now, that's kind of not how it goes. Right now, it's kind of like people come into the Octant channel and go, I'm working on plugins, and I found this over here and this over here. Am I doing the right thing? And we want to remove that barrier that's there. A couple folks have asked for this as well. Just even folks who are already writing plugins will find it useful, because when they don't write a plugin for a while and then come back and want to do a new one, they don't have to relearn all of these kind of hidden steps. So we want to get that in place. And then we also want to make a clear user guide for getting started, just for users of Octant. So I'm a developer and I'm not intending to write any custom plugins. I just want to use Octant against my dev cluster and use it to make my life better and help me ease me writing my software that's going to run in cluster. So right now there's some video demos and a couple blog posts, but again, that information is kind of spread across multiple media. So we want to get a nice, focused, clear getting started guide up on octant.dev for folks that are new to Octant and just want to get it running and using it. And that's, there's one other thing. And Sam has a question about this, I think. I assume it's from Sam. It might have been from somebody else. But around plugin documentation and documenting the components themselves. This is part of that, the line item where we're wanting to creator content for plugins. We want octant.dev to be the source of truth for plugin authors. So you will go to octant.dev and you will click plugins, and then there'll be the getting started, which is what I just described, and then there'll be the API, and you'll click API, and what you'll get is a list of all of the important APIs for plugin authors. We're going to kind of get rid of, right now, when you start to drill into plugins, you're getting a mix of like internal APIs and external APIs, and it can be confusing about which ones you need to care about. So we're going to create a nice interface for that so that you can clearly see, here are the APIs I care about as a plugin author, and I can go read about them. I can find out how all these components work. I can find out what the parameters to these components mean and do, and that will, I think, will be kind of the starting point for us doing this revamp of our documentation. And then I just want to follow that up by saying, I'm sorry that it's taken us so long to get to it. Documentation is very important to me, and it's very important to developers, and I feel bad. So we're going to fix it. Any questions around that?
So you're saying your distinction, you're doing a distinction between what's on octant.dev and what's in markdown in the repo. Will you try to push as much as possible out to the doc site? Is that the plan? Or
Yeah. So the only thing that we, Milan, Sam, and myself had a quick conversation and kind of agreed. I think we agreed. I'm going to assume we did. We agreed that everything that's in site should be a user and creator content. And the only thing that should be in the core repo, in markdown files in the core repo, is I want to contribute to Octant core. I need to know the architecture of Octant, or I need to know how to create a brand new component from scratch, or things like that. That's what's going to live in the repo, and we're not going to push that stuff out to octant.dev, mainly because I think it can kind of create a little bit of confusion between plugin authors and core contributors. And I want to create a distinction there, because a lot of our plugin authors, I was saying this to Sam and Milan, they don't want to be core contributors. They just want to write their plugin, right? So like, it just happens right now. We're very early, and so a lot of them end up being both. But I would like to create a clear distinction, and I want to make octant.dev the focus for content creators, so plugin authors and users of Octant.
yeah, I think that makes sense. Maybe further out, we'll pull some of that content in into the site as well. But yeah, I think that definitely makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Right now. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, moving on to the next item of focus, we're going to be revisiting not revisiting, really starting on the Electron application. So this has been kind of a long-running, it has kind of having a long tail on it, because it was depending on some Angular 9 stuff, and then that depended on Clarity 3, and then so it just kept getting pushed and pushed. But now there is a Electron scaffold in master. It's actually released with 0.11. And we are going to be moving to make sure that we can get this up and running with the navigation redesign that Milan and Ross have been working on, and making sure that we have the breadcrumbs in there since we won't have like back and forward buttons in your standard browser nav and things like that. And all of this ties into our overall goal of having better CRD handling, loading without a kubeconfig, some plugin management, and some settings. And all of these issues exist in GitHub right now. There's an epic that tracks all of them under our application epic. So if you're curious about what this kind of looks like from a issue and swim lane perspective, I encourage you to check out our Zen Hub, which you can find linked in the repo, the main README for the repo, and I think right there on the community page. Yeah. And that's there's not a whole like that's kind of it around the Electron application. It isn't a like, most people using this will just find it easier because they will no longer have to run things from the command line, and they'll just, especially Windows users, they'll be double click the executable. Right now, if you double click Octant in Windows, it says this is a command line app. And that's it. That's all it says. It's very unhelpful. So, and this will also remove a whole host of issues around what happens when you start Octant and you don't have a kubeconfig, or you have a kubeconfig and it's pointing to a server that you don't have access to, or that has gone away. And right now, a lot of that can be a little fuzzy and not clear as to what the next steps are to fix that. So being able to load Octant without a kubeconfig, and then having all of these error messages and things surfaced up into the main application instead of spamming out to a terminal will kind of remove a whole class of issues or it won't remove the issue. It'll surface a whole class of issues that'll allow people to take the steps to properly move forward. So. Okay, moving on to the plugin API v1. So this is going to be kind of the last area of major focus for just kind of this next body of work we're going to be doing. And this is, we have an epic issue for getting the plugin API up to v1. There are some new components, and I want to call this one out because there was also a question asked about it. but being able to inject your own HTML JavaScript assets directly into the page via a component, that we definitely want to have that before we do a version 1 of the API. Multiple people have asked for it. We're still working on kind of figuring out the best way to do it. At least for version 1. We don't want anything that's going to cause like conflicting HTML or JavaScript problems. So we're going to do our best to kind of encapsulate that stuff, but at the same time, you know, there'll be some obvious caveats to it. Like if you inject a different version of Angular and start doing stuff, the expectation that is going to work, considering where we're using Angular, is probably low. And so we'll be sure to document some things as we go down the road of getting like a web component in place. And then the documentation around plugins, which I talked about previously, we want to get all of that in place so that it's easy for folks to discover the different components and the important APIs for writing a plugin. And so that's it for kind of our upcoming focus. And I'll just keep rolling unless there are any questions, and I'll just stop when those come up. Jonas is holding his hand up.
Yeah, just a question. So this is for, just so everyone understands. So the Electron application, the documentation, the plugin API, you're saying this is going to be the majority of the next body of work. Where do you have like a rough timeline of when we can see the first version of the Electron app? Do you have a rough timeline of when the documentation will be available properly on octant.dev? Just things like
that. No. There's no rough timeline. I could make up something, but it wouldn't be, I don't know how accurate it'd be at all. I will say that this upcoming focus of work here is not, I don't see this as what we're going to be a release of O.12, for example. This is work that's going to happen, and then we will move on to the next up. And then as we address things in next up, that's about the time we'll be cutting in O.12. Or depending on how the Electron application stuff goes, if we get things like self-updating in place, you know, we'll cut an we'll like maybe try to cut an O.12 early so that we can then start using the self-updating feature. And then we're not necessarily cutting octant versions, and then we're more focused on the plugin version. And just to recap, I've talked about this before, but just to help people who might be hearing this for the first time, currently we ship binary releases of octant, and when we do that, we cut a whole new release and we increment the version number and we move forward like that. So as we move towards having the Electron application, it will have the ability to self-update. So there will still be releases of octant, and they'll still be versioned for our sake and the sake of bug tracking and reporting issues and things like that. But the important version number for octant will become the plugin API. That'll be the version that will of octant that will actually become what people care about from a creator and dev standpoint. From the user standpoint, you'll care about it as well, because if you want to get a plugin and we're happen to be on plugin version 3 and your plugin is version 1, then need to be an update, probably at least to get it to 2 and 3. So the plan will be to support 1 back, you know, with proper deprecation warnings and things like that. So, but just to kind of give folks an idea of what the landscape's going to look like, is that the plugin API version will be the important version, and this also becomes the case when further down the road later in this calendar year, when we start to do the planning and the thinking and the implementation around octant in cluster, being that it will be a plain web app running in cluster. Again, the version itself won't really be the important thing. It'll be how it communicates with plugins, which right now we're saying it won't, but that's a problem we'll eventually address. But also how it will communicate with the versions of the Kubernetes API, just like Octant now, where the actual version of Octant won't be as important except for with reporting issues and bugs.
Cool. That's a very well thought out answer. So thank you.
And then the up next stuff, these are things that we'll be doing. We don't have the full details around them yet. We just know that these are going to be what we're going to try to look at addressing after the current upcoming focus. Editing resources, we know that's important. We want to do it. We want to do it well. We want to do it in a smart way so that you have type ahead, so that you have information coming from the API server to inform you on your custom resources and your config maps, things like that. Resource viewer, workload viewer, we kind of want to tighten up how those interact with each other. We want to be moving towards making the workload viewer, resource viewer, and object status kind of this view into your namespace and into a workload, and driving the navigation and driving where you go to find out things like health and things like what steps need to be taken around a workload. Right now, these pieces they exist. They're not really cohesive. They're not put together in a way that where they're all working together. And object status in particular is really lacking in detail and in useful information that can lead us to actionable items. And the reason we want to move towards making these things work together, and especially getting our object status updated, is because once the resource viewer and workload viewer are kind of a joint tool for navigating a workload within a namespace, and object status has actionable items, now we can get into your name, like this thing is looking for this config map. It's called foo. The only config maps that exist in this namespace are called bar. Do you want to edit this resource to use config map bar? Yes, right? Like being able to do something like that is where we want Octant to go and in the direction we're heading. So that is why this kind of this next up category is focused around that interaction with workloads in the cluster, workloads in your namespace, getting real rich object status from the resources in a workload, and then being able to do actionable things. So edit those resources. Any questions there? Cool. And then future is Octant in cluster. I'm just going to leave it at that. Yes, we're going to be working towards the idea of getting Octant in cluster. It has been something that has been requested. We have intentionally not pursued it because we wanted to focus on getting some of the other internal features and interfaces within Octant up to a certain state before we went back to revisit in cluster. So this is really just it's still just a heading on a blank piece of paper in cluster. We haven't gone through and done any of the planning, or we've started to think about it. We started to take high level notes, and eventually we'll be diving into planning. I imagine some of that planning will be happening. That planning will be happening through the proposal process that we have for Octant. And that also the brainstorming sessions will be public and happening depending on like the length of community meetings, or during, I have Octant office hours during those types of sessions. So all of the planning around in cluster will be documented, and then we will be doing a formal proposal for the initial implementation of Octant in cluster. There is already a branch in the upstream for Octant in cluster that has the outline, which is basically, like I said, it's just headings in a markdown file of in cluster. So we'll be adding information to that as we progress. I can actually I can link that branch so that folks can follow it if they are interested in doing so. Yep. And that's it. That's as far as it currently is. So, and I wanted to just retouch on. So I've had some folks take advantage of the Octant office hours, and it's been really great. I just wanted to remind everyone that on Thursdays, so in this case tomorrow, I do Octant office hours between 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and they're open to anybody. You go, you click reserve a spot, and we can talk about anything Octant related that you want. So folks have used it for plugin stuff, and I think we're talking to I'm talking to somebody tomorrow for I don't know. I'd have to actually look. I don't know. I just know I'm talking to 2 people tomorrow. So it's whatever they want. That's what we're talking about. And so that's it for the main bulk of the community. I did want to say another thanks to Jordan Jensen, who has been a member of the community and contributing to Octant from very early on, like since we open sourced it. I just want to say thank you again. He might not be around as much, so if that's the case, I just wanted to say a big thanks to him for all of the contributions and being a part of the community.
Hey, really appreciate that, guys. Thanks.
And now we have a demo from Milan.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I just want to give a quick update. Let me just share the screen first. Actually, share this. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right. So we've done quite a bit of work on reworking the navigation. And as you know, the current navigation is basically a tree view that has a lot of problems. It's a pretty complex issue. We have a lot of items, and the way tree view handles them is not so optimal. So we wanted to switch over to what Clarity calls the vertical navigation. And then during that work, we realized maybe we need to divide things a little more into domains. We experimented with adding those domains into the header, and Russ did the amazing work putting those into mockups, and we played with those for a while. But then at the end, we kind of thought maybe this vertical nav should be sufficient, but it had some problems with it. As you can see, there's still quite a few groups, and some of those, so for example, if I go to services, and then you go to workloads, there's a bunch of things open, but we thought maybe, well, quite a usual thing is if you expand one thing, maybe you can collapse everything else, which will save quite a bit of vertical space. And the question was, so that by default is not supported by Clarity, the library we are using. So I did a little bit of work to test if that's possible with Clarity, and as you can see, it is. And it does work pretty well. It saves a lot of vertical space. And in the same time, you can, the animations, I think Clarity is handling the animations pretty well. Sometimes those are not so optimal if you have one thing's collapsing, the other one expanding, but I think Clarity is handling that well. So that was pretty comforting to be able to do that. But then the other thing is this thing is still using a lot of horizontal space, but then if we expand it, if we collapse it, we'll save all that. The problem here is that some of those icons are not that descriptive. And then I played with that a little bit, and I tried using tooltips for that. Although I hate Clarity tooltips, I think that's a little helpful. And this saves a lot of space too. And the thing is, if you click on one of those, it just opens that flyout. As you can see, there's not much going on there, so it still saves a lot of space. So this is kind of where we are right now. There's still a bunch of issues related to the plugins. As you can see, I have one plugin here, but if there's a bunch of plugins, this may become quite bigger, and also the custom resources. But overall, I think this is a step in the right direction with the vertical navigation and expanding, collapsing. We can even remember the state, so you can come back in. And especially as Wayne was saying, that we're gonna start using the resource viewer more for navigation. So in that case, maybe navigation like this will be sufficient enough for the, just the reminder of the navigation. So for example, for some things that you don't access so frequently, you can always go back here and try to find them and so on. So that, I don't want to keep everybody so long here. That's pretty much all I had. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, please let us know what you think.
This is great.
I have one question, and probably to rope Ross in here since he's also on the call as well. So we had a talk about where the namespace selector should live, and I noticed it was actually omitted here.
Right.
And do we have plans to put it back up to that top bar?
The more I think about that, the more I think it belongs into header. And especially now, if you use collapse expand, obviously it's pretty hard to show that in the collapse state. And the way it was implemented initially, it was showing up only in the expanded state here at the top. But then you get into problem, and those things don't align. If you collapse, as you can see now, those icons, if you watch them as they collapse, as they expand, they stay at the same place vertically. So I think the top header is probably the best place for it. Especially it kind of belongs there together with filtering and some other filtering by labels and some other filtering that we may introduce in future.
Cool. Yeah, this is good. Is there just for folks who are watching, is there a specific issue that this work's happening under? I know there is. What I'm saying is, do you know the number offhand so I can link it?
I believe it's 340.
Okay. Yeah, it is. Thank you.
All right. So 340 is the one that that's talking about this.
Great.
So I think the next thing will be just to figure out how we're going to do the plugins and custom resources, because they are the trickiest ones.
Excellent. Thanks. Thank you.
you.
All right. So we got two open Q&A questions here. Let me share my, Milana, if you can stop sharing. Perfect. And then I'll share my screen, and then we can talk through them as well. All right. So the first one here, I don't know who actually added these. If you're on the call, feel free to speak up and we can talk about them.
First one was me. That was Andy Schiefelbein.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. We have some college students doing some stuff for us right now, and they hit an issue that I actually just hit as well, where they're wanting to do some more native JavaScripty type of stuff, HTML, JavaScripty, CSS stuff that wasn't available in the base install. And to my very limited understanding right now, in order to poke things through to the UI, you have to go through the octant wrapper, and that's not always conducive to visualization in a way that would be much easier if we just had access to the underlying components that are. I'm assuming, and probably incorrectly, that under all of this, that Octant is rendering HTML or JavaScript and then passing it to the browser, which is rendered for the user at that point. In some cases, it would be easier to be able to just edit HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and have it rendered than it would be to go through a wrapper. And I think that's where that question comes from.
Okay. Yeah. So I can answer that and add some clarity to kind of how Octant renders things via plugins or components, which is what plugins use as well as Octant itself. So yes, we want to support this ability to allow plugins to send plain HTML and JavaScript to the front end and then handle that, just render that as a straight, pass through. The way Octant currently works is we take a JSON object and we encapsulate it into some metadata and then some content, and then we send that into the front end, which is our Angular application, and then that JSON content we take the metadata out of it to then map it to a component, so the list component or any of the status component, any of the objects that you see, cards and stuff like that. Those are all parsed from metadata to map it to the Angular component from the backend component. And then there's usually some type of data or content blob that is then injected into that component before it is rendered out to the screen. Or maybe it's rendered to the screen, but Angular handles the rendering of it once the content that the component contains has been updated. So in the case of making Octant support the ability to do HTML and JavaScript from a plugin as kind of a pass-through, what we would likely do is we would create a web component, and that web component would have its metadata to flag that it is that type of component. And then likely we would have some type of embedded fields for the JavaScript or the HTML, or some way of saying, like, here is the plain HTML JavaScript that we want to inject into the view of our plugin, and then that would get passed over the wire. The component would get rendered via Angular, and then the content, the JavaScript and HTML, would be injected into the page. So that is the process that Octant uses to put stuff to the front end. There's actually no HTML JavaScript generation happening on the back end at all. It's just metadata that maps the component type to a front end component type, and then a data blob, which is structured JSON that Angular can then render into that component model.
Thank you for the explanation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Andy. And I can make sure to. Actually, you already +1 to that issue. So yeah, you'll see when we get the web component in there, you'll get notified of that. So I know that you're already on that issue.
Awesome, thank you. The next question here, do we have the person who wrote that on the call here?
Yeah, that was me.
Yay!
I was right. Right.
Yeah, so this is with regards to our docs push for this particular release. And I'm starting to work on doing some auto-generated documentation for our components. I've started on this a while back, but then I dropped it for .11 issues. So I'm picking back up into this. And so this is a neat little tool that can just use doc strings and it'll generate everything we want. The thing I don't like about this is that it breaks continuity with the octant.dev website, and it might use too much Angular semantics, whereas most people might just simply be interested in the component itself. So I just wanted to throw out in a community meeting to see how we feel about something like this and whether or not having extra information here that's more pertinent to Angular is going to be confusing, or whether or not we should just use a tool like this and just save a bunch of time.
Well, so my initial reaction to this is that this is better than what we have now, which is not much. We have the table content that you generated, I believe, that has like the table of our components and some parameters that they take. But I think it's at this point it's out of date, and I'd be willing to try something like this, and then potentially we could modify it to suit our needs or hide some of the extra bits that are maybe would add some confusion. But I think taking the time to investigate this as an option is worth it, at least.
So yeah, so Sam, you said that this would break compatibility with octant.dev. So it's absolutely entirely possible to have this be under a different subdomain or something like that. So it could be devdocs or angulardocs.octant.dev or whatever you want. So I'm more than happy to help you set this up if this helps you in documenting how to build Octant and the different components that you use. Absolutely.
Sure. I'll add this to the existing issue, and then we'll move on from there.
Awesome. That'd be great. Thank you, Sam.
All right. Do we have any other comments, questions, concerns on the call today?
Silence is no.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining today's call. This will be uploaded to YouTube shortly. And with that, have a fantastic rest of your week, and see you all next week. Have a good one.